Hey guys, we're moving on to chapter 3, which is on meiosis, development, and aging, and we're beginning with section 1, which is on the reproductive system. We're going to talk about genetics and how that is the study of genes being passed on or traits being passed on. Kind of need to talk about the passing on process. So we are going to talk about the reproductive system. I know, kids don't like this, but it is still important. So here we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle looks at as it says, the ovary and how it matures eggs in order to allow them for the possibility of fertilization. So it's roughly a 28-day cycle. Day 1 is what we also call stage 1 or the follicular phase. And this is where the follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, will actually stimulate a follicle to grow into a mature follicle. Now, what a follicle is it's an egg surrounded by these very particular cells that we just simply call follicular cells. So it's the egg cell surrounded by these follicular cells. That's what the follicle is. So the follicle stimulating hormones and the luteinizing hormones, the ovary starts to create more of those, and the presence of those stimulate the follicle to start maturing. This will take roughly about 10 days, at which time our estrogen is starting to be secreted at a higher rate by the growing follicle. And this causes an increase in luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So it's kind of this interesting positive feedback loop. So the presence of the FSH and LH stimulate the follicle to mature. The mature follicle then secretes estrogen, and the estrogen causes more LH and FSH to be secreted. So as the FSH and LH levels rise, it leads to the estrogen from the follicle being secreted, which then causes the LSH and FSH levels to rise even more. Around day 14 is when ovulation occurs. So the follicle and the wall of the ovary will actually rupture and it'll push the egg out. And the reason why it does this is because of the increase in the luteinizing hormone. So the amount of LH reaches a certain point, it causes the follicle to push into the wall of the ovary, and then it pushes the egg out. Day 15 on, we call it the luteal phase, and the follicular tissue in the ovary forms what's called the corpus luteum. And the presence of the corpus luteum is going to cause an increase in both progesterone and estrogen production. About day 20, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, which means that the progesterone and estrogen levels are going to decrease. And then by day 28, we are back to the follicular phase. So estrogen, progesterone levels are further down, and we're starting to build up the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So this is just kind of showing you essentially what's going on. So here we have the egg cell surrounded by the follicular cells. So this is the follicle. It starts to mature and get bigger. And these are the two hormones, the LH and the FSH. They're kind of low, but notice that they're starting to increase. Now we have a fully mature follicle. When they both reach their height, that is when ovulation occurs. So the egg cell is going to be pushed through the follicular cells and out of the ovary. Then we have the corpus luteum, forming from the residual follicles. And you'll notice that these levels, this is the point where they level off. So corpus luteum gets bigger, and then it breaks down, and we're back to where we start, where we now have a new egg with its own follicular cells around it to go through this cycle. And this is kind of just, once again, just showing you now in a different way what's going on. So we have the follicle, the egg surrounded by follicular cells. It gets bigger and bigger, so it's maturing thanks to the LH and FSH. Then notice how it's getting really close to and pushing into the ovary wall. At ovulation, it pushes the egg out. The egg will then be picked up by the fallopian tube and the fimbriae. We'll talk about those in a moment. The leftover follicular cells become the corpus luteum, which will affect the levels of progesterone and estrogen. It'll break down. Levels of progesterone and estrogen decrease, and we're back to starting with a new egg. All right, menstrual cycle. So we talked about how the egg leaves the ovary, but now we got to talk a little bit about how the uterus prepares itself for the implantation of an egg. Now, this is also a 28-day cycle, but it's not exactly aligned with the ovarian cycle. So day one of the ovarian cycle is not day one of the menstrual cycle. They're kind of staggered from each other. So day one, the menstrual flow begins, and this is the beginning of what's commonly called the period in women. So day one of the menstrual cycle is when you start getting rid of the previous uterine lining. And this occurs because the estrogen and progesterone levels are low. So that'll take, anywhere from 5 to 7 days to get everything out. Around day 5, though, is when we begin what's called the proliferative phase. This is when the regeneration of the endometrium. Now, the endometrium is that uterine lining. So what happens is the uterus is actually going to build up this tissue along the inside and thicken it up. And that's what the endometrium is. This is what the fertilized egg will implant into in order to start growing the baby. So we start rebuilding a whole new endometrium at day 5. Day 15 to 28 is known as the secretory phase. So we have our base endometrium done, but now we're going to continue to thicken it up to make a nice squishy pillow for a potential baby. If no fertilized egg has implanted in it, then by day 28, we are back to the menstrual flow, which means that we're going to shed that endometrium, that uterine lining, and reset the uterus so that we can prepare it for the possibility of a new egg and maybe a new fertilization event. All right, so this is just kind of showing you what's going on. So we begin day 1, low levels of estrogen and progesterone. The blood is just simply the shedding of the endometrium. So the uterine lining ends up pretty thin. We start to increase progesterone and estrogen, and you'll notice that first we just build the base layer, and then as these levels increase, it gets thicker and thicker until we reach this point where the progesterone decreases. The estrogen's still a little higher at that point, but the progesterone decreases, and then the estrogen follows along behind it. And that's going to cause a breakdown of the endometrium, and then the discarding of the previous endometrium so we can make room for a new one, a fresh one. All right, so this is just kind of looking more at the, just kind of looking more at the front view, and it's kind of combining the ideas of both of them just a little bit. So here, menstruation, we're shedding the lining. This is the first 5 days. Around this time, this is when the follicle is maturing as well. Not quite all the way there, but the days, like I said, don't line up. So these days aren't exactly in line with these. Let's just focus on the uterus right now. So we shed the lining. Notice it's a lot thinner in there, more roomy. And then we start building up that lining again. It thickens until we reach day 28, where we start to break it down and we discard it and get ready to make a new one. All right, so this is just looking at those two pictures, once again, kind of in line with each other. Let's see. So this is just showing the comparison. Again, even though we're showing them both starting at day 1, those 2 day 1s are not at the same time. And this is just what I thought was a pretty funny little comic. I know, I'm a little messed up. So this is kind of showing you what's going on with the egg versus the uterine lining. So the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. So we have low estrogen. The follicle starts building up here. And then ovulation occurs when the uterine wall is nice and thick. Then we see the luteal phase, everything's breaking down. And then even here, we start seeing everything breaking down and being discarded. All right, let's see. Sorry. Now we can go on to the female organs. We are going to talk a little bit about the structures and the functions of the different structures of male and female reproductive organs. I know this tends to make kids a little more uncomfortable, but it is important. We're going to talk about them strictly in a biological sense. We're not going to get into the health class aspect, so you don't have to worry about that. So first, let's talk about some of the internal structures. We mentioned that there is the ovary. This is what contains follicles, which is an egg cell surrounded by follicular cells. And it is a reproductive organ, but it also produces estrogen. So it doesn't just hold the eggs, it also produces one of the main hormones involved, which is estrogen. Starting at puberty, one follicle matures and releases an egg during each menstrual cycle. So what that is saying is, well, first of all, there are 2 ovaries, one on each side of the female body. And each month, once puberty hits and the girl goes through sexual maturity, then each month, and one of the ovaries will release an egg, will go through ovulation. And typically it actually alternates. So one month it'll be the left ovary, the next month it'll be the right, then left, then right, then left, or however. After the ovary, we have the fallopian tubes. These look kind of like the horns coming off the uterus. The surprisingly thing is, even though the egg goes from the ovary to the fallopian tubes do not actually touch the ovary. They are a funnel-like opening, but on the end, around where the ovary is, they have these finger-like projections called fimbriae. And the fimbriae are these little tissue fingers. I mean, they're not actual fingers, but they kind of jut out like it. And they're at the edge of the fallopian tube, and they will draw the follicle, draw the egg cell into the fallopian tube after ovulation. So if this hand is the ovary, how it sits is the fimbriae get really, really, really close to the ovary, but they don't actually touch it. So once the egg is pushed out of the ovary, they'll be close to the fimbriae. The fimbriae suck them up, and then they start traveling through the fallopian tube. The fallopian tubes end in the uterus. The uterus. The uterus is a thick muscular organ. It's kind of shaped like an upside down pear. So it's kind of wide on the top, thinner on the bottom. It's on average about 7 centimeters long and about 4 to 5 centimeters wide. So it's not really big when it's just at rest. The lining, which we call the endometrium, is very, very, very richly supplied with blood vessels. This way, if there is a fertilized egg, then it'll have a good blood supply to get oxygen and nutrients from mom and to pass on carbon dioxide and waste back to mom. And that's why during the menstrual cycle, why we oftentimes think of it as blood that comes out, but it's actually not blood that comes out. It's highly vascularized tissue. So it's tissue that had a large blood supply. The uterus is very, very, very muscular. The muscles are super thick, which makes sense because remember, it's starting out kind of small. But then when a baby starts growing, it has to be able to stretch to a much larger size. And it's able to do that because of the thickness of the walls. As it expands, the walls become thinner and thinner. Now, if you already had thin walls to begin with, you wouldn't be able to stretch that uterus as much as you need to keep the baby safe. So that's why it's such a thick organ, even when it's not working or when it's not pregnant. The cervix is the neck of the uterus. So at the very, very bottom, there's the opening to the vagina. And that's what the cervix is. It's essentially the doorway that separates the vagina from the uterus. The vagina is a thin-walled chamber that is internal. So it's the canal, the birth canal. And it also serves as a repository for semen, meaning that is where the ejaculate is, I don't want to say secreted, is accepted into the woman. And then the sperm can then travel from the vagina through the cervix up into the uterus and to the fallopian tubes. I start talking about the external structures. So first one is the clitoris. It's a bulb of erectile tissue at the front edge of kind of like the vestibule down in the external structures. Now there's some interesting things about the clitoris, and one of the things is they believe it has, in that small little knob of tissue, as many nerve endings as the head of the male penis. And one reason why they think that is, one hypothesis, is because as it gets stimulated during childbirth, it can get, kind of get shoved around by the expanding of the vagina, that the clitoris can actually help lower the pain receptors. So it can actually decrease the amount of pain mom feels when it's stimulated during childbirth. And then there's the folds of skin on the outside. There's 2 layers, the labia majora, which is the outer layer of skin folds, and underneath that is the labia minora. And those are, again, skin folds that then protect the opening of both the vagina and the urethra. Those are 2 separate openings in females. The urethra, where urine comes out, is not the same place as the vagina, where the menstrual blood or the baby comes out. So those are 2 completely different openings in females. The 2 labias protect those openings, keep them from getting exposed to, foreign matter, dirt, etc., because you want to keep those areas clean to prevent infection. All right. So here's a front view. Here is the uterus. You can see how thick the walls really are. They're super duper thick. These are the fallopian tubes, one on that side, one on this side, both of them ending in the fimbriae, which are near the ovary. So the egg leaves the ovary, gets picked up by the fimbriae, and led into the fallopian tube. Now, this is actually where fertilization occurs. Fertilization will occur in the fallopian tube, not the uterus. So once fertilization has occurred, then the egg moves down, comes into the uterus where it will implant into the endometrium. If it was fertilized, then it will start developing into the embryo, then fetus, and will end up with a baby. If not, though, the unfertilized egg will still attach to the endometrium, but then during the menstrual cycle, it'll slough off, come down through, here's the cervix, the connection point between the uterus, and here's the vagina. So that is also known as the birth canal. And this one's just really showing you the internal structures. Here you'll be able to see the external structures as well. So again, we have the ovary, the fimbriae, the fallopian tube, leading to the uterus. You can see how thick it is. This separation here, that's the cervix. This is the vagina. Then we have the labia minora and the labia majora. And right here, this little tiny knob here, that's the clitoris. Now, if you're wondering what else this is showing, this is the bladder, so the organ that stores the urine, and then the urethra, where the urine exits. And then this is the colon and the rectum. Just kind of give you a little reference point. All right, let's move on to the male organs and structures. See, we're not forgetting the males. I know we talked a lot about females so far. That's just simply because that's where the development of the baby comes in. So there are 4 main structures that are related to sperm production and transport, and 3 main glands that help the sperm with preservation and surviving. So let's start off in the testes. So the testes are located within the scrotal sac or the scrotum. These are kept outside of the body because their sperm is extremely heat sensitive. So by keeping the testes in the scrotum outside of the main thoracic cavity of the body, it lowers the temperature just enough that it doesn't damage the sperm. Now, the testes themselves are composed of tightly coiled seminiferous tubules. So these are little tubules, essentially little tissue tubes that will go through meiosis and produce the sperm. The surrounding tissues around the seminiferous tubules are what will help produce a lot of the male hormones like testosterone. On the top of the testes, you have something called the epididymis, and this is where the new sperm have been matured. So the seminiferous tubules make the sperm, but they're not fully functional at this point. They have to mature. So they're sent to the epididymis where they mature and then stored until they're used. Once arousal has occurred and the process of ejaculation has started, the sperm will move from the epididymis to the vas deferens. This is a muscular duct, and it connects the epididymis to the ejaculatory duct. So in other words, it's going to move and provide passage for the sperm all the way up until it gets to the urethra. The penis, also known as the glans penis, is composed of 3 cylinders of erectile tissue that become engorged with blood during sexual arousal. So what that means is when a male becomes aroused, these 3 cylinders of tissues allow for increased blood flow so that they can expand, and that's what the erection is. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the glands. We have the Cowper's gland or the bulbourethral gland, and this secretes a clear mucus that will neutralize any acidic urine left in the urethra. Here's the thing, urine is naturally acidic, not like hydrochloric acid acidic, but it is acidic. Remember, we already said that the sperm were super sensitive to heat. They're also super sensitive to changes in pH. So what happens is before the semen passes, before the sperm passes, the Cowper's gland is going to secrete this clear mucus ahead of it. So this is a lot of the pre-fluid. And the point of it is to move through the urethra and completely neutralize any leftover acidic urine so that the lower pH doesn't affect and kill the sperm. There's also the seminal vesicle, which is a gland located kind of behind the bladder. And this secretes a fructose-rich fluid, and in total, the fructose-rich fluid is roughly about 60% of the semen. Now, the reason why it does this is because it provides, one, lubrication, and a medium for the sperm to flow through and swim through, but it also provides some nutrients for the semen or for the sperm as well. Sperm can actually survive up to 3 days in the female's body before the female's body heat breaks it down. And one of the reasons why it can survive up to 3 days is because of this fructose-rich fluid. And then we have the prostate gland. So it's a large gland that kind of surrounds the very top part of the urethra. And this gives a thin, milky secretion that has enzymes which prevent coagulation of the sperm, meaning it prevents the sperm from sticking together. Kind of like how blood cells can stick together, the sperm cells can as well. And this enzyme that the prostate gland gives off is going to prevent that. So if the sperm aren't all stuck together, they can swim more easily. They can swim more easily, and thus have a better chance of getting to the uterus, up into the fallopian tubes, and fertilizing an egg. It's really easiest to see the male structures from the side view, which is why I don't have the front view also. So what we have here is this entire sac is called the scrotum. And inside the scrotum, that's where the testes are. That's where the sperm is produced. Then the sperm goes up here to the epididymis, where they mature and are stored until sexual arousal. When an ejaculation is about to occur, they then move down and into this duct, which is the vas deferens. That's going to come up and around the bladder. This is the bladder here. It's going to come up and around the bladder. Here we have the prostate gland. Oh, sorry. That's seminal vesicle. I was looking at right here. So here we have the seminal vesicle. So this is going to produce the high fructose fluid. And that's going to join the sperm here, right by the prostate gland, where the prostate gland is going to add the anticoagulant enzymes. Now here is where it joins up with the urethra. From here on out, it's in the urethra. So remember, in females, the urethra and the vagina were completely separate, I don't want to say tunnels, but openings. In males, the vas deferens will meet up with the urethra, and the urethra is used for both reproduction and waste removal. So the sperm and the semen will then move to the urethra. Now here's the little tiny bulbourethral gland, the Cowper's gland. This has already sent its neutralizing fluid through. So this already sent the neutralizing fluid through. So by the time the sperm makes it to the urethra, don't have to worry about the acidic, any leftover acidic urine. So it goes through the urethra and comes on out through the penis. And that's what this structure is here. You can see the thicker tissues. That's where the, or those are the contractile tissues that will engorge with the blood, which is what will allow for the erection. All right. And that concludes the lesson on the reproductive system. Hope it wasn't too terrible for you guys. Hope it didn't scar you too much. If you have questions, hit me up in our Google Classroom, email, or actually in class. But yeah, stay awesome, stay curious, and most importantly, stay safe and healthy, you guys. All right, till next time. Bye-bye.